It may come as a surprise to some, but 2007's LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga has a competitive and developed speedrunning scene. Hidden within a straightforward, tongue-in-cheek children's game is a complex, deep, and mechanically demanding platformer that a large group of dedicated runners have put countless days of effort into completing as quickly as possible. From the Trade Federation ships over Naboo to the trenches of the Death Star, the Complete Saga has a large variety of levels, each with their own set of interesting skips and game-breaking glitches that make the any % speedrun faster to complete. Today we are going to look at Mos Espa Podrace, perhaps the most famous level in the game, and home to one of the flashiest skips in the speedrun. If you played LEGO Star Wars as a kid, you may remember the Podrace level being difficult to complete. You are likely remembering the version of the level found in 2005's LEGO Star Wars the video game. Although the prequels portion of the Complete Saga shares the same levels from the original, many aspects of the game were reworked and redesigned, with Podrace being one of the more significant changes. In the original game, the level is split into 9 sections, with 3 sections in each of the 3 laps. If you run out of time in any section, or lose all your hearts and die, a short cutscene plays and you have to restart that section from the beginning. The further you make it into the race, the less lenient the timer on each section is, with the 9th section offering almost no room for error at all. For children, this race was pretty difficult to complete, which inspired the developers to redesign the level for the follow-up game. In the Complete Saga, each lap is now one continuous loop. The timers have been removed, and dying now respawns you where you died, instead of at the beginning of the section. The controls have been simplified, and pod racers now move much faster, which is very obvious if you compare the 2 games side by side. The added speed in the Complete Saga is a result of a constant force applied to the player that pushes them forward, even if the player is holding backwards. From a casual perspective, so much of the challenge was removed that you can actually beat the first 2 laps without pressing any button at all. In a speedrun, all these changes from the original game resulted in the easiest and most consistent level in the any % category. Since it is pretty difficult to die if you race correctly, and the constant force almost constrains you to the fastest lines, Mos Espa Podrace boiled down to essentially an autoscroller, where the time for the split was more dependent on the menuing you did prior to the start of the level than on the actual gameplay. Podrace took 4 minutes and 37 seconds to complete, and as the 4th level in any %, it was pretty unfortunate that such a large time sink had to be played right at the beginning of the run. And for almost 15 years after the game's release, that was the only way the level could be played. Until July 2020, when glitch hunters Javster and P53 posted this individual level speedrun that beat the world record by 34 seconds. Let's see how they did that.
To be honest, I don't think this trick makes this IL worse, because I think this IL would already be just bad. Normally.
That was a good menu.
That was pretty good. The big one is you shouldn't hesitate on the menu after cutscene.
I think that was excellent.
I think that was excellent.
I think that was
Don't
good.
hesitate after this menu after cutscene. Prepare it and... Okay, shift them out. Okay, now you have to do heavy tilt. Heavy right tilt. Heavy right tilt.
That's good, that's good.
That might not hit cutscene. A little bit more right.
I think we're set.
Yeah.
Oh, I completely forgot to time that. Okay, so yeah, so the laps are now meaningless, but the final time should be fine.
This out-of-bounds glitch skips most of the second lap of the race, and became known in the community as pod fraud. To understand how it works, let's look at the layout of the course. As I mentioned earlier, the pod race map in the Complete Saga is one continuous loop. The race begins here, at the starting line. The track takes the racers through some rock formations and past some sinkholes before entering this cave. At the exit of the cave on the first lap, a short cutscene plays of Tusken Raiders shooting at the racers. The track continues through this canyon and past another set of rock formations before rounding a corner into the final straightaway and crossing the starting line again. The second and third laps are identical to the first with only minor changes. The main difference happens during the second lap, when a short cutscene plays about 10% of the way through the track. It shows a racer crashing into a rock formation, causing the path to get blocked after you pass it. This event forces the track to diverge for the third lap. Now that we've seen how the track is laid out, let's break down the mechanics of pod fraud. The first lap plays out mostly the same as before, only changing at the final straightaway. The pod racer then veers towards the left wall here, instead of heading to the boost pad. There's a corner in this wall that the pod racer can get stuck in, and if you hold forward into the corner and utilize the game's drop-in co-op feature to bring player 2 into the game, the second pod racer will spawn partially in the wall and continue forward out of bounds. Player 1 can then be dropped out. With the player 2 pod racer, you continue forward, remaining out of bounds until you get closer to the starting line. This next section is the tricky part. As player 2 approaches the second lap, player 1 is called in again. Player 2 then veers to the right towards the starting line, while player 1 goes left to remain out of bounds. As soon as player 2 crosses the starting line, the cutscene that usually plays in the first rock formation of lap 2 is triggered. This is because the game automatically plays this cutscene during lap 2 when the player is 10% of the way through the track. Since player 1 is still behind the starting line, the game registers the player as being significantly past the 10% mark and plays the cutscene instantly. As soon as the cutscene finishes, player 2 is dropped out. It is important for player 2 to be dropped out as quickly as possible, since waiting too long will result in the camera pulling player 1 back in bounds, making the skip impossible to complete. Once player 2 is dropped out, player 1 can be angled towards the other side of the map. The center of the map has strange properties that accelerate the player due to that constant force that pushes the player along the track. Once in the middle, the player will repeatedly fall into a kill plane, building up speed on each successive death until they are fast enough to make it all the way across the map. The reason you need to cross the map in this way is due to a mid-lap checkpoint trigger that exists here. Similarly to racing games such as Mario Kart Wii, the pod race map only counts a lap if you hit the checkpoint. At the time of the trick's discovery, the exact location of the trigger was not yet known, so Javster aims further to the right than he needs to. After coming back in bounds near the mid-lap trigger, the player has built up so much speed that they accelerate through the rest of the lap much quicker than normal, before hitting the trigger for lap 3. After the trigger for lap 3 is hit, all the built-up speed is lost, and the rest of the level is played the intended way. Although this skip saved 40 seconds right at the start of any percent, players did not immediately start implementing it into runs. The trick was rather difficult to do consistently, and you can only attempt it one time each run. Messing up the trick in any way resulted in over a minute of time loss, and forced the runner to reset. The most common way of missing the trick was messing up crossing the starting line to trigger lap 2. If you veer too early, you miss the trigger entirely and get stuck having to play an extra lap. Veering too late would pull player 1 back in bounds, making it impossible to perform pod fraud. Additionally, each death taken to cross the center of the map lost 4 to 5 seconds, and getting across in as few deaths as possible could not be consistently done. Although top runners did improve their success rates in the months following the trick's discovery, and started to implement it into runs in fall of 2020, it was still failed regularly and considered to be one of the hardest skips in the speedrun. Veteran and newer runners alike hoped for a new setup to be found that would help increase success rates and decrease the death variance. After only a few months of running any percent with pod fraud, a high-level runner named Zentorian seemed to have found a solution. In late December 2020, he posted this video of 2 new strats that made the trick both faster and easier. Let's break down these new strats and see how they changed the way the trick is done. Zentorian clips through the wall the same way as before, but then immediately drops back in player 1 and veers directly left. Once player 1 enters the center of the map, both players get the acceleration effect, and player 2 speeds straight forward, bouncing off a rock before hitting the lap trigger. By the time the cutscene ends, Player 1 would have died once and Player 2 can be dropped out. Player 1 is much further back than with the previous version of the trick, which puts the player closer to the mid-lap trigger. After only 2 additional deaths to cross the center, Zentorian drops in Player 2 again, 1 death before Player 1 would normally have enough speed to make it back in bounds. Player 2 spawns in slightly higher than Player 1, allowing Player 2 to hit the mid-lap trigger while Player 1 dies. After respawning, Player 1 heads directly to the end of the lap and triggers lap 3, skipping an additional trip across the center of the map as well as most of the high-speed movement through the track. This new method for hitting the lap trigger at the start of the trick required only 1 input to be pressed, making it easy to execute even for less experienced runners of the game. This method could also be repeated at the end of lap 3 to speed through the final straightaway 2 seconds faster than the casual way, making the whole level now 8 seconds faster than with the previous version of the trick. Since this method could also be done with 3 deaths every time, instead of the 4 to 5 that was common with the older strat, the trick also had much less time variance. But that is not the end of the development of pod fraud. Shortly after the faster version was implemented, runners Zacc, Bricko, and United 9 Jackson devised a way to skip 2 of the remaining 3 deaths needed to cross the gap. By turning around with Player 1 after clipping out instead of going straight left, the player can stay alive for long enough for Player 2 to trigger lap 2. Player 1 then continues towards the bottom of the track, building up speed while also decreasing the distance between their respawn point and the mid-lap trigger. From here, crossing the gap only takes 1 death before Player 2 is able to hit the mid-lap trigger, and the rest of the trick is completed the same as before. Although this method is harder than the previous version, it is just as consistent and saves an additional 4 seconds. And that is how the trick is done to this day, enabling Mos Espa Podrace to be beaten in 3 minutes and 45 seconds, a whole 52 seconds faster than playing the level the intended way. Since the discovery of pod fraud, LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga's any % speedrun has continued to be grinded and optimized by a number of runners, and they are all thankful that the trick replaced a mundane part of the early game with a version of the level that is much more interesting to play and watch. What was once easily one of the most boring parts of the run is now one of its flashiest levels, which goes to show how time save can be found anywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. Thank you for watching. I plan on making more LEGO speedrunning videos like this in the future, so if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and have an excellent day.